right?
On the motion, this House should allow performance-enhancing drugs. I welcome the Prime Minister Arusha.
You are only as strong as your weakest link. The ability for people to make decisions on how they enhance themselves and to push human boundaries should be one decision that should be legitimate and should be recognized by everyone. But especially when performance-enhancing drugs is a method of enhancement that is no different from any other method of enhancement that exists within status quo, we think it's only fair that you legitimize this decision for an individual to do so. Before I move on to my case, few clarifications. Number one, what is a performance-enhancing drug? A performance-enhancing drug is basically a drug or a tool, something that you consume to make your performance and be enhanced for a particular period of time or anything like that. It may contain side effects. Number two, what is professional sports? Basically, a player who earns salaries, who works either in the international arena or the national arena. But number three, we think that's important. Here's our policy, right? Number one, we think that we will be fully aware of who are the individuals that are taking these performance-enhancing drugs, just like how we are aware of what other method of enhancements any individual takes within status quo. Number two, we think that it's important to understand that we inform these individuals of the harms of the performance-enhancing drugs that they are consenting to. So before you consume the performance-enhancing drug, or before you take it in, you're fully aware of what it can do to your body, what it could do, and whether or not you still want to make the decision after that form of informed consent. Number three, it only applies to professional players, not to any other player, to a player that is an adult who understands and is basically rational by the yardstick of age. Our problem on twofold. Number one, we think that ability, especially performance-enhancing drugs, is no different from other method of enhancement. It disallows the ability for sportsmen to push boundaries further when it comes to the status quo. But number two, we think that even if it is already banned, humans are in the nature that if they want something, they will always get it. And how they constantly take drugs with the status quo, we think that the method that they're taking those drugs are harmful and dangerous, which is another reason as to why we must legitimize this action. Two arguments for you today, Mr. Speaker. Number one, on why there is no objective manner in what is good when enhancing your bodily performance. But number two, on why performance-enhancing drugs removes the limit that humans necessarily have and allows individuals to push boundaries within status quo. Before there are any clarifications.
Sir, then is it justified to require this in order for the glory of the game?
We think that it's important to understand that different people are different. If you as an individual who want to participate in this, and if you think this is a worthy trade-off for your own organs to fail, we think it's fair enough that you be allowed to take this decision to begin with. Just like smoking. Sure, smoking may be bad to a lot of people, but to people that necessarily think it's a worthy trade-off, we legitimize the action for them within status quo, right? First argument, why there's no objective manner as to what is good when enhancing you. What are the current methods of enhancement when it comes to your body in the arena of sports? You have things like, attire, you have things like coaches, you have things like doctors when it comes to training you, you have things like methods of sports where you participate and you use different types of machines that exert your body to a particular level. These are things that already exist within status quo. They're already legal to a certain extent. Within equipment or coaches within these kinds of scenarios are also methods of enhancing your performance. We from side government argue to you that there's no such thing as an unnatural or a natural manner to enhance your body when it comes to performance enhancing drugs. Few questions you have to ask. Why is performance enhancing drugs banned to begin with? Three primary reasons. Number one, it enhances your body by an extra mile that people don't think is legitimate. Number two, it's a consumable item that no one should somehow consume. Number three, that it provides extra harm to your body, then therefore because it's harmful, people already ban it to do so. There are three reasons why these methods of deciding whether the individual should be banned is wrong. Number one, on the idea of enhancing your body by an extra mile, it is similar to a status quo, where you have machinery that enhances your body by an extra mile. When you have machinery that pushes your boundaries, you change as a person and you develop the skills to become a more enhanced person when it comes to sports. Similar to that, enhancing drugs does the same thing that any other method does with the status quo. The only difference is it's consumable and not, work when you do it in the machine. Number two, when it comes to consumable items, people say that just because you can consume it and instantly gain energy, it's bad because it's a form of cheating. Within the status quo, there already exists. When status quo, you can have diets or certain types of vitamins when you take before you go to sports. Similar to that, should have the ability to take performance-enhancing drugs. Because when you take diets, you gain energy. When you take vitamins, you gain energy. When you take protein shakes, you gain energy. The simple leeway and the simple idea legitimizing is that the same as performance-enhancing drugs in itself. The third reason is that it's harmful and it's dangerous towards people, then and therefore we should ban it for a lot of people. We think when you go and strain yourself in machinery, when you have the ability to tear your limbs and ligaments within your body, those are also harms that we legitimize within status quo. Why can't this harm be also a legitimate matter to go and measure your own performance-enhancing? The conclusion to this level is that the reasons why performance-enhancing drugs are banned is illegitimate because the similar characteristics that apply within status quo are same to any other method of enhancing your performance. Why is this beneficial? Not only do you legitimize an individual's right to choice, but secondly, we think that another problem that exists within status quo is that countries with money will always be the top countries within the sporting arena. Why so? Because when countries have money, they have the ability to buy best coaches, they buy best medical procedure, best attire, best training methods. These don't exist when it comes to poor countries who don't have the ability to do so. Why is this beneficial? Because when you have performance-enhancing drugs, no thank you, when you use performance-enhancing drugs, you train performance-enhancing drugs, you put poor countries or countries who don't have that much capacity when it comes to financially aiding the sportsmen or sportswomen, no thank you. We think that it's important to understand that it's another method for you to go back up on the sports pedestal and not continuously be under countries like England, like France, like Germany, where they have the ability to only train and when you don't have the ability. Then therefore the conclusion is that you as a poor country have the ability to be part of that sporting arena and thus be as competitive as another country. We don't think that a barrier should be whether or not you have money, because sports isn't necessarily about money. No. Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, sir, yes or no, right? Then these countries who are richer than the poor countries have the capability to develop even better performance-enhancing drugs than the poor countries.
Because when you say status quo, performance-enhancing drugs is already developed. There's already a recognized body that determines what is a good drug, what is a bad drug to be given with the status quo. But any other country can develop a performance-enhancing drug. It's not that expensive. But when it comes to training methods, when it comes to buying equipment, when it comes to buying coaches, when it comes to buying medical professionals, that in itself is expensive, can only be afforded by a few countries, and those countries always stay on top. We don't think it's fair for countries to always stay at the bottom. One of the second argument on how performance-enhancing drug removes the limit that people have. We always legitimize the choice of an individual, especially when you're informed of the circumstances that you could be in. For example, these are individuals that are rational, number one, but number two, they're always informed of the consequences of their action. We always allow dangerous things. When it comes to trainers, where world-class athletes are allowed to participate and train for 23 hours a week and endanger themselves, why not allow these individuals to endanger themselves through performance-enhancing drugs? Because it's similar. You have the ability to endanger yourself, you consent to those dangers, then therefore you participate and be endangered. We think it's only fair that this decision is made by the athlete. But if you're an individual who doesn't want to be endangered, you can always opt out of the system. We don't think there's a problem. Why is this beneficial? Number one, your determination as an athlete is limited by the human capacity you necessarily have. You allow athletes who are driven by passion to push boundaries with the status quo, to push the arena of sports that they're necessarily in. But number two, you empower the right to choice of an average athlete. We think that the right to choice is not just limited, we're already limited to only specific training methods. But when it comes to these kinds of performance-enhancing drugs, it's just as similar as how other training methods enhance you as an individual. We think it's important to understand. We're very, very proud to propose.
Thanks, Lucian, for your speech. Now, welcome the Leader of Opposition, Yun Sun.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, we see today a side government that's been running away from the fact that these drugs could contain tangible harms and side effects to these. They did not address, even though they said that a lot of points about how athletes already expose themselves to tangible harm, right? But it's not really a tangible harm because there are safety precautions of the things itself. Like they brought to you about the example about how sports equipment and how they endanger themselves towards tearing a muscle, all these kind of things. We tell you that fine, this is a harm in itself, right? But this is not a permanent harm. You can still heal a muscle. But when you take drugs, when you take steroids, right, you end up with permanent harm to your body in the future, right? And we believe it's very perverse of side government to actually try and propagate the morality where you have to take drugs in order to be an athlete. And why do you have to take drugs? Couple of rebuttals for you. Okay, this is a sport. They do not understand that it is a sport and the nature of the sport itself. A sport is a competitive thing, right? People are going to want to compete against each other. So when you allow these kinds of drugs to be legalized in sports, in the sporting world, right? Let's say if competitor A takes drugs, right? And competitor B will feel like he's being left out or that he's behind the pace. And because of this competition itself, because of the drive to win, right? They'll be blinded by this, and it's not really informed choice, because the coaches will push them to win. The coaches will want them to take these kinds of drugs in order to win. And this is the nature of sports in itself, because it is so competitive, right, that it's not really becoming a self-informed choice in itself. Okay, now they talk to you also about how the methods of taking the drugs are harmful in itself, right? Sit down, sir. We tell you that that these athletes, right, will take extra drugs because of the, even though they already have like the drugs that are being regulated, right? We tell you that they'll take extra drugs because they want to win even more. Because now you're propagating that, okay, drugs are a good thing, right? When you take drugs, you become as a better person. The side effects, that's something you worry about later. The most important thing in sports is that you glorify yourself, you glorify your country. You don't need to care about your body. That's what they're trying to propagate under their side, right? And performance enhancing drugs, because some of them do give you immediate kind of energy and this kind of stuff. But we tell you the fact that these kinds of food substances, they do not contain any side effects, which is what they've been ignoring. Sit down. They've been ignoring the total fact that these drugs are harmful in itself. These drugs are the things that actually cause tangible harms that we can see. Okay, before that, yes, fine out.
Sir, this kind of diet that players take into a consent to often dangerous to the body. They don't get the amount of results that a normal average person. How do you become performance enhancing drugs when the same side effect occurs?
Okay, look, this is the difference, okay? Performance enhancing drugs has this immediate side effect. It's guaranteed already when you take these kinds of drugs, right? But then these kinds of drugs on the opposite end, these kinds of like food substances or minerals, these kinds of things are regulated by the coaches or the food dietitian of the club or the team itself, right? And then these kind of things are already regulated because there's no unnatural substances in it that cause you like unnatural body chemicals. Now, okay, some clarifications on how these drugs actually work, right? These drugs are actually stimulants. What happens is that they block the pathway from your synapses, right? And they prevent your neurotransmitters from transmitting things properly. And we see that the immediate tangible harm of this whole thing is that later on, right, even though it doesn't harm you effectively straight away, and it does give you this energy or this extra edge or muscle power right now, right? In the future, right, a lot of these people who take drugs actually have the chance of developing muscle degeneration at a very rapid rate. They have chances of developing Parkinson's disease, right? Because of these kinds of extra drugs, because of the fact that these are the nature of drugs. These are the side effects that side government aren't trying to address at all. But no, sit down, sir. Now, I have 3 substances for you. How it sets a negative precedence towards drugs. So it sets a negative precedence. How it tarnishes the beauty of the whole game of sports, and how there is discrimination towards countries and people itself. On to the first point, how it sets a negative precedence. What government is trying to say is that now, oh, it's okay to take drugs, right? Because now everybody's going to take drugs, so it's not becoming a level kind of playing field, right? But we tell you that this is a very perverse idea coming from them, because they are saying that, okay, it's okay to sacrifice your body for the glory of the sport. That's what they're trying to say. But we tell you that is not the case, right? Government shouldn't incentivize these kind of things where you're allowed. Sit down, sir. Where you actually sacrifice your body simply for the glory of the game. The whole point of sports is that it's a level playing field, right? Everybody trains as hard. Everybody is on this kind of level playing field. The game is based on talent, hard work, and discipline. But now when you're taking this kind of sports, right, it actually like defeats the purpose of the sports in the first place, right? And how it sets a negative precedence is that people will all like take these kind of drugs, right? Because of the nature of the sport, right? And we see that these drugs are addictive, right? Once they take, they don't stop. Let's say they're even like kicked out from the team or the club, right? They will even become drug addicts and take this kind of further kind of stimulus, because that is the nature of drugs. It gets you hooked on it itself. Now, how it tarnishes the beauty of the game, right? I've told you already how it's based on hard work, talent, and discipline. And people watch these athletes because they know that they train. Sit down, sir. Because they know they've trained hard, right? They've used their talent, they've used their efforts, they used their time in order to train and become and glorify their country. But now, when you're taking these drugs, when you just say these kind of things that, oh, once you take these drugs, you don't have to work as hard, right? It's not going to be as difficult for you. It's telling the people that this is a kind of shortcut way of sports, and it's not really about okay. And how it does is that there are millions of kids, right, who actually idolize these kind of sports heroes, right? And how it tarnishes the game is that as a parent, right, would you want your kid to watch these sports knowingly that your kid might be influenced to actually take these kinds of drugs? Because now the heroes that they idolize, all these sports, sit down, all these heroes that they idolize, right, are actually taking drugs. So as you see, kids are very easily influenced, right? So then they'll be like, I want to be like this person, so I want to take drugs. But then in turn, the parents know about this, so the parents will not want these children to even watch these kind of sports, which tarnishes the whole purpose of sports in a way. Because sports is actually a spectator event where they want people to look and see, sit down, no. Where they want people to actually see, right? And like this, like goes against the whole idea of sportsmanship in itself, right? Sportsmanship is the idea of fairness, right? That nobody has this competitive edge in itself. But by doing this, right, it relates to my third point, how it discriminates people and countries itself, right? On how it discriminates people. Number one, it discriminates people who have high moral values, who know that drugs are bad in itself, and who do not want to take drugs. However, even though they have the talent or whatever, right, they still do not want to take drugs. But therefore, because they don't take drugs, they're not as good as the people who take drugs. Therefore, they are being discriminated because they have the talent, they have the capability, but because of the moral values that they have within themselves, they do not take these kinds of drugs, right? And we see that it's very unfair to discriminate against these people. And number two, how there will be a sort of drug race happening, right? I told you that these countries, right, it discriminates poor countries in itself, because poor countries, right, will lose out against the richer countries, because the richer countries are able to develop better drugs. And what happens is that this sport suddenly becomes about who has the best drug, who can provide the best drug to your players, and which is why they brought to you about the harm, about how they want to mitigate about the poor countries having better lousier coaches, right? We tell you that that harm is exacerbated under their paradigm, and it's better under our paradigm, where you maintain status quo and do not incentivize these people to take drugs. So what I have talked to you about today is how it sets a negative precedence, how it tarnishes the whole beauty of the game, and how it's discrimination towards the countries and the people. Thank you.
Deputy Prime Minister Kishan.
Sports can never be a balanced playing field, no matter how much side opposition wants to argue it. But in our everyday lives, the things that we consume, the way we train, all this affects every inch of how we perform on that daily task. This is why they set a goal which they could never achieve. Because making sports a balanced thing is making the very fact that everyone trains the exact same way, everyone consumes the exact same thing within their diet, which is something that we cannot regulate within our status quo. The only thing that we can do is make and ensure that these individuals who are below that pedestal, or individuals who are in that unfortunate circumstance, who want to train at the exact same momentum but are not given the chance, we can afford them and give them the luxury of making their choice within status quo. A few level rebuttals before I move on to my first one argument. Firstly, because we talked to you about how these individuals within circumstances like this are not given a chance, because the richer countries always have things like giving extra diets that might even harm these individuals up to that point, like giving them extra lesser minerals within their diets, or even things like forcing them to use that machine to make them more fitter individuals, while at the same time putting them under physical and emotional pain within these kinds of circumstances. This is why we told you that there's no quantifier as to what is right and what is wrong within sports. We can extend this luxury towards things like actually taking performance enhancing drugs, which are regulated, which is something that they didn't want to cater to within these circumstances. So the first form of rebuttal, because they try to tell us that now corporations have a likely to develop more drugs, because it's an extension. They said that US is a richer country, they can develop more drugs. Three levels of responses. Firstly, there's a certain limit as to what's a perfect drug. A perfect drug is something that is quantified to give you the best experience as to what you can do. We are nearly perfect with a certain limit with status quo. Therefore, we can already ensure that they can't keep building more drugs, because the outcome will necessarily be the same. But the second response to this is corporations have an incentive to expand their profit and go international, Mr. Speaker. That's why we recognize if a corporation makes this drug, or a corporation makes an performance enhancing drug, they're more likely to spread it on a larger scale of giving it to almost every other country in the world, just like how every other drug is marketed. So we can ensure that every other country in this entire world, we get that new drug and the exclusive drug, thus making it fair, and thus making the latest forms of information, the latest forms of drugs, fairer. But they try to tell us that now, you know what, if there's large forms of tangible harms, people get Parkinson's disease, people get muscle degeneration. Yes, we concede. We understand that every other person who makes his choice at the end of the day is a person who will suffer from severe harms, or suffer from some form of side effects which we cannot regulate. But is it that choice not achieve his dreams? Is it a choice worth making for the other person who thought it was the right choice to make? Because even if you don't give him that choice, he will still execute it anyways in illegal manners, because that's something we have to keep in mind. But that's also an argument against all things that individuals do in their lives. Things like smoking. We need to recognize these individuals do this for certain various reasons. Things like reducing stress for individuals. It varies from different individual to different people. So if that person believes that taking drugs is not something that he should do, he won't do it, Mr. Speaker. That's why the influence argument could not stand. Because if this person thought that he was going to be left out from not taking drugs in these circumstances, we don't necessarily think you could have hung on to your beliefs that much more if you're a person who was rigid towards believing that was right. So under your paradigm, you assume that everybody will just flagrantly go towards taking drugs, even if they think that is wrong from their very beginnings, right? But then you have three arguments. Firstly, how we try to tell us it's a negative precedent, so thank you. Secondly, how it's a tarnishing value and how it affects children. Thirdly, how try to tell us is discriminating individuals who don't choose to take these drugs. Three responses towards the first argument. Because the precedence that you already try to argue is truistic. The precedence already stays in the status quo. We've already proven to you that there is no balance, there is no balanced platform for people to play sports within status quo. So if you're going to argue that there's a negative precedence, that now everyone can play it in different ways, that already exists. We don't need to argue against that because sports in itself is already subjective for the very fact. The principle of level playing already falls and can never stand. Because no matter how hard a person wants to work, the external factors always affects how he performs on that day. The external factors in his opponents always affect how he performs on that day. So the precedence is already there. But then there is argument, and this is a funny argument, on tarnishing value, because now you influence children. Children are always influenced. So just because a child wants to be influenced to do it in the modeling industry, and the modeling industry is based on societal perceptions, which condones you into doing things like wearing wings for Victoria's Secret, which can hurt your backbone structure, there's already direct innate harms to every single status quo, so you consenting to every single profession already has severe harms. So influencing a child is not something that's wrong. Influencing a child to be what he wants to be is something we need to accept, because every other job has its consequences, every other job has its trade-off. After my last rebuttal, the last rebuttal is this: discrimination of people. No, we recognize that these people didn't take drugs, that's why we don't discriminate them for not taking drugs, Mr. Speaker. The very check and balance that already exists within the circumstance is that this person doesn't take drugs, he will recognize the person who tried his best without taking drugs, thus not leaving him out of that sphere of drugs. One of my arguments, sure.
Okay, clarification, sir. Under your paradigm, how is that a balanced playing field? Because we can see like richer countries and poorer countries. Why in the world would richer countries want to share their these kind of capabilities when they are able to actually create these kind of drugs? Why would they want to share it in the first place?
That is why we argued that there's no such thing as a balanced playing field. Side opposition needs to learn and listen to our policy. But even if they're trying to argue that these countries are selfish, the same way we market medicine, the same way we help poorer countries already shows a depth towards other countries, or the very fact that we already condone into helping poorer countries in circumstances like this. We don't necessarily think there's a problem. First argument, black market and transparency. Because the demand still stays and people want drugs. Because even if you wanted to argue that you idolize every other person who won that gold medal, you idolize every other person who won that silver medal, will you ever know at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, if he did take drugs? Would you ever know that he was a person who was true to himself? There's no form of transparency under their paradigm. Bribery happens from richer countries. Things like buying extra, having diets is something we can condone to, which will never be transparent. Sports cannot be transparent until the point that you accept that some people make mistakes, but how you regulate those mistakes are something that's good. Why is this good? Because you fund the black market under your paradigm. You fund drugs which are never clinically proven to be helpful, or clinically proven to be tested into helping these people live better lives or progress as much as more. You escalate the chances of people getting cheated, people eating harmful substances from the black market. They won't even enhance their performances, but will kill them with even inhumane morphics. It's not clean, it's under their paradigm. It's filled with things that are initially harmful. It's something we need to recognize. We create more transparency under our paradigm. We know who takes it. We know the standards for every other individual who's true to themselves and every other individual who chooses to push those limits and chooses to push this barrier. Under our paradigm, we can recognize and choose to see who's going to be that idol, and choose to see who's the person who can legitimately be as the best runner as possible under our paradigm. We create that disparity as to making sports a transparent form of career and profession. We recognize that this might bring people harms, but like every other trade-off that everyone makes on this planet, it comes with severe harms. You make that choice because you're the one who's going to sustain all those harms from making that choice. These individuals will take sufficient amounts of drugs which won't kill them up to that point, which are regulated by the FDA. They can't give us a reason why these people shouldn't be allowed to push those limits, which they could never push without these drugs. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you, Tricia. Now for the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Derek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So a lot of flaws coming from side government and a lot of, weird statements coming up from them and a really flawed mechanism as well. And I would like to point that out in my rebuttals today. But before I move on, let me just summarize what has happened in today's debate so far. Basically, us coming from side opposition, we have already talked to you about how this sets a very negative precedence among society, and they conceded to that fact. So we tell you that they conceded to the fact that this precedence already exists in status quo, right? Yes, we totally agree with that. But we tell you that, however, if you actually implement something like this, it will further aggravate or it will further, encourage this negative precedence among society. You see, because I'm a hardcore Chelsea football fan, and if I find out that my idol John Terry starts taking drugs, I might actually be badly influenced by it, and I might actually think that I would feel like taking drugs so that I could improve in my football as well. So we tell you that this is something that could happen that would actually further aggravate the scope. And secondly, they talk to you about how this will actually level the playing field in terms of how certain countries are more advanced because they have better equipment, they have better medical team and so on. But what we tell you is that yet again it further exacerbates the situation. You see, because my leader of opposition, please let me finish, have already clarified to you about how certain some of these countries. Like for example the UK or the US, who have actually a better technology or better research and development department, they can actually or pharmaceutical companies, in fact, they can actually find out or discover even better drugs, performance enhancing drugs for their own sports, for their own athletes. You see, and they would and the government would forbid it or actually restrict them to actually sell it internationally, because they as clarified by my leader of opposition earlier, professional sport is something that is very competitive. So obviously the government would like to keep it to their own country, to restrict it to their own country, so that their athletes can be the ones who actually back the goal for Olympics, in the upcoming Olympics. So we tell you that in that sense, it doesn't level the playing field, but it further, increases this inequality. So with that, let me just move on. Okay. Yes, before that.
So a person being forced to only certain things which can affect the growth of himself, or a person working 12 hours to try to be the best athlete that they can, it's not the same as a person who chooses to take painkillers that can prevent him from suffering that pain during his effortless work to try to become a better athlete.
Okay, I'm glad you pointed that out. Okay, so basically, we tell you that all this, he talked about how a few of these athletes, they work 12 hours to actually obtain all this, to actually, perform well in sports. So we tell you that itself proves that it is very unfair, because there are a lot of all these athletes who, even after this is implemented, do not wish to take up all these performance enhancing drugs. So in that sense, we tell you that because other athletes are taking up all these performance enhancing drugs, they actually lose out, you see, because even though they have the talent, they have the skill, or they actually work way harder than all these opponents who actually take all these performance enhancing drugs. However, they're losing out, which actually directly links to my point. And please, no more POIs. And yes, and this also links to their last point about how he talked about how all these athletes are not being left behind, but I'll talk to you why in my contentions today that they are actually affected. Okay, so today I'm going to be explaining to you about how this entire implementation actually affects. I'm going to be talking to you about the possible outcomes that might actually all these occur. Okay, so firstly about how it affects the athletes. Yes, of course, government side can come up and tell us that that is the freedom of choice and it is an informed choice to all these athletes to actually take up all these drugs. Yes, we concede to that fact, but that only applies at the beginning of this entire implementation, you see, because we concede to the fact that yes, many athletes will actually refuse to or do not wish to take up all these performance enhancing drugs. But we tell you that then itself, at that period of time, they would feel left behind, because they would feel like, okay, for the sake of your understanding, okay, let's just take it to let me just give you a parallel example. For example, if my school actually discovered this drug that could make me a perfect debater, and then you lose to me in a debate because of that, isn't that then how will you feel if you're the one losing, and it is only because of these performance enhancing drugs, while you are actually the one who is way better, who has a better level of skill, better level of talent, and has worked way harder? We tell you that then it's not leveling the playing field at all. It's very unfair, and all these people would be left behind. So what will happen? Firstly, their coaches in itself. There will be conflicts amongst the team, because probably their coach would then force their players to actually take out all these performance enhancing drugs, you see. So all these players will be forced to actually adhere to all these orders from the coach, or they have to quit the team because they are just simply not good enough, because they cannot live up to the expectations or to be as good as others who actually take out all these performance enhancing drugs. So we tell you that all these athletes who do not wish to take out all these drugs, at the end of the day would stand no chance in the team, you see, and they will be forced to quit now that these drugs are permitted. So we tell you that itself is very unjustified. Please sit down, no more. Okay, so now moving on to my next point about about the possible outcomes of this entire implementation. So let's just look into the best case scenario, no more. Let's just look into the best case scenario, which is less likely, okay. Assuming that this entire implementation actually works out and the performance of the athletes are really boosted and people actually enjoy watching all these athletes, we tell you that even so it is not worth it at all, because on the first level we tell you that all these performances are not based on the talent or the skill or the hard work of all these athletes themselves, but instead based on the quality of the drugs designed by their pharmaceutical companies or their country, you see. So we tell you that is not worth it. But on the second level, we tell you that this is a very bad trade-off, in the sense that the health of all these athletes will be deteriorated, and there are so many side effects, as clarified by my leader of opposition earlier. And who is accountable for all this? The government is the one who should be blamed, because they believe that the entertainment value of all these performance enhancing drugs overweigh its detrimental harms, which are to the athlete themselves, to their health, and to the audience, because many people will be then influenced to or think that taking up all these drugs will be okay even if it is illegal, you see. So now let's just look at the worst case scenario. We tell you that most people do not like the idea of drugs as a whole. So we tell you that the professional sports, which is watched by many, fans will start to hate, you see. Fans will start to feel betrayed, and the entire institute of sports itself will collapse. Nobody will watch anymore, because apparently we tell you that this demeans the entire beauty of the game. It tarnishes the beauty of the game, and because of all those reasons, I'm very proud to approve.
Thank you for the speech, and now for the last government substantive speech from Permata.
Since there is no clear way to distinguish from a legitimate or illegitimate artificial aid or a way or artificial aid to performance, we think it's no other difference than any other synthetic or different developmental aid or developmental performance enhancing things that other things that athletes do. We think that the importance that we create for performance enhancing drugs, or the importance that we create to level the playing field, or to give the chance to that person who never had that chance, who had that same amount of talent but wanted to work as hard as that player, who had the resources, who had that coach, who that other players' country couldn't have because of their unfortunate circumstance. That's where we create the justification. That's where we stand for the principle of sports in itself. There are two issues to today's debate. First of all, how do we stand by the principles of sport, and secondly, the subsequent value that we of the athlete that's created when you use the performance enhancing drugs. But before I move on, let's have one thing that didn't fit into my issue, right? Have a seat, sir. Because the contention that came from them was that now the idea of safety was never entitled with, because the idea that we stand for is that when you legalize doping, there is more control, there's more tests that will happen to ensure the safety or the health of the athletes in itself. This is where we have more form of regulation. We have more researchers put into performance enhancing drugs. That's why we can create the best out of the worst. That's why we can create the best out of the drugs that we can perform to them, because even if there's some form of harm that's going to accrue to them by taking the performance enhancing drugs, we already know it because we already have the research and all the developmental problems, because we can make the best out of the aid. But the first issue on how does it stand by the principles of sports, because they wanted to tell you that it's unfair because they sacrifice their body. That's the problem, because you assume it's a bad thing from the get-go. That's why we changed the perception, because now there will be forms of regulation and there will be forms of improvement to the drug that is put into place anyway. For a legit option of enhancement, where we create, now it'll be a legit option for players to even choose to have performance enhancing drugs, like any other things that players already do, like my first and second speakers already explained too, like things like training equipment, things like the different shoes that you wear from other players, the different clothing that you wear from other players already gives you some form of nudge in the way that you play. We think that other players don't have the capacity to do so. We think even if that's allowed, we think that this should be also. The second level is that the athlete's life, talking about the athlete's life, an athlete's lifestyle is already endangered in nature. The reason why you get injured most of the time, the reason why you go to more surgeries than any average reasonable person is the fact that you push boundaries upon yourself. It's not because you want to, or is that you're forced to because of the competitive arena, because if you want to be the best, you gotta beat the best. And if to beat the best, you gotta do all these things that you gotta push the amount to the limit that you can. This were examples like training overtime. Training overtime and how you're forced by coaches, because this was their contention. They told you that no, now coaches will force you to take performance enhancing drugs. You have to take it more. Even in fact, we told you that that's why we have regulation that will control the amount that you take. These are forms of things that we already told you. And if coaches can force you to train overtime, if coaches can put you on a machine that will tear your limbs, why not on a regulatory measure, regulated measure that will provide you with a performance enhancing drug that will be the same value that will be created. But before I move on, sure.
Sir, on the point of how you wish to give the chance to the player who doesn't have the resources, right? Then aren't you discriminating the player, right, who actually cannot afford the drugs in the first place? Because how is he going to take these drugs? Or the player who doesn't want to take these drugs?
See, that's a problem. Number one, you already create a fair level playing field when you distribute, or when you allow for the chance for that player to go and obtain the drugs in the first place. But what discrimination you're talking about? It's worse than me not having performance enhancing drugs and put the same human factor as that other player, then rather not having the training equipment, not having the same coach that he had, not having the same amount of money to host the World Cup that he had. These are forms of things that will put them on the lower pedestal, that will discriminate them even more, because I have to laugh their ass off because you didn't have the money. It wasn't because of nature that you lost to me, it was because of an unfortunate circumstance that I can laugh about because I have it. But in this case, it's different, because you had the same drugs that you could have obtained, I had the same drugs that we took. It's pushing you to the highest limit that a human can go to. It's about the training. It's about that higher level of things that you put on from then on. The second issue is that this way the POI also links, because it talked about the idea of talent and hard work. People in our countries that cannot do much, that want to work hard, that have talent but cannot, then what's the difference? We tell you that this is why this policy is good, because you provide them with that option. But the third level is that they talked about the idea of like coaches. This is where I half dealt with it already, because they told you, is the problem the coach or the player then? Because if the problem is that the coach is abusing his power, if the coach is the one that is forcing your player to, if the coach is the one that is negligent in this case, that is forcing the player to do things that are illegal, to do things that will harm the player in itself, we think it's a problem of the coach. Because if he forces you to do other things as well, if he forces you to put you on a technology that you don't want to and you don't have a choice, we think it's the same level pedestal. But in this case, it's even better, because you have a wide level of information. You have all the information that you need about performance enhancing drugs. You have all the level of consent that you need to be better than the other player, because you know that he's also taking performance enhancing drugs. The second issue, the subsequent value of the athlete that you create. Talked about the idea of how side effects will come into a play, and now how this will be inefficient and so on and so forth. Yes, we agree that there might be some form of side effect, but how is it better under our paradigm? Because now we can make that drug that you take better, because we have more information, we improve the drug, we increase the number of research that we can put into, we develop the drug as a whole, because now it's better for that player to take hold. Even if the player takes that drug and he has to fall back into healthcare, or if he has to fall back to the medical treatment at the end of the day, we will know how to deal with that problem at the end of the day, because we know how that person was instigated, or how that problem or the treatment was stimulated in the first place, because we know all the forms of variation. But under their paradigm, it's not like that. People will continue. Like for example, Tyson Gay a few days ago was banned from that run that he ran because he took drugs. These are forms of things that will perpetuate. These are forms of things that will never stop, and they will never have that form of transparency. They will never have the amount of information that they will have under our policy, because we think that the people that choose to not to take up the performance enhancing drug is even worse than the paradigm that you put them in, because they don't have the chance to obtain the equipment that you will have. They don't have the chance to play the best form of sports that you will play. For all those reasons, please side government.
Thank you, Madam. After that substantial speech,
Now, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This has been a debate about whether the legitimacy of the drugs, of these kind of performance-enhancing drugs, is okay, or whether about this kind of performance-enhancing drugs, there are these kind of harms that might be brought into society, which was not responded by side government, right? Okay, so what are the points that were brought on today's table, right? Side government, right? They came in and talked to you about, okay, it's legit. There's no fair playing field in sports at the end of the day, and they also talked about how these kind of at the end of the day will push the boundaries of the people in the sports, right? Now, we on side opposition, we talked about how it tarnishes the beauty of the game. We also talked about discrimination, and the one point which they did not clash with us at all, and when there was no form of response, is they didn't even attack us on our points about the effects on society at the end of the day right now. So what is government trying to propagate, right? See, when the government, right, they can't solve the problem, right, which is to regulate this kind of performance-enhancing drugs in status quo, right, just because they can't solve a problem, and they have to legitimize the problem, right, to make it common, just because they can't solve that problem in the first place, right? But we tell you that even if you're trying to regulate these kind of problems, even if you can't solve it, you try to regulate it. We tell you that there are various risks that shouldn't be taken by side government at all. Decline. Now, okay, so on the first, on my first clash about how our point about the illegitimacy of this kind of performance-enhancing drugs versus the point on about the legitimacy of the performance-enhancing drugs. Now, on the first level of analysis, right, because we can see that these kind of obvious examples, like Lance Armstrong, right, because when people know that the Lance Armstrong, right, he took this kind of performance-enhancing drug, and people are not pleased by this idea, right, because this society, from then on, decline of the, please take a seat. From then on, we can see about the society's perception about performance-enhancing drugs. Right? We can see that society despises and dislikes the idea of performance-enhancing drugs, right? And even if side government would try to talk about how the people will enjoy the game now, how people actually enjoy the game more, because now the game is faster, the game is stronger, and the boundaries are pushed. But the problem is, we can see that this kind of that society does not like the idea of performance-enhancing drugs. So examples like Lance Armstrong, decline. Now, okay, they also didn't really tackle a point on how it actually influences these kind of key professional level to take this kind of teenage athletes or the performance-enhancing drugs. What they didn't really take into account is what about these kind of teenage athletes? What about these kind of minors? Or what even if they're adults, right? Because now they idolize these kind of people that take performance-enhancing drugs, but it's not legal for them to take these kind of performance-enhancing drugs because they're not on the international level, because they're not on the professional level. The problem we see is that at the end of the day, these kind of people, they don't have that kind of fun, right? It's illegal for them to take performance-enhancing drugs. So what they go for is that they're up on this kind of idea of taking this kind of unregulated performance-enhancing drugs, right? They'll take on this kind of illegal drugs because they're not playing on the professional level. This is the problem that we see. What will happen in the long run is that society will be affected. They'll be like incentivized to take this kind of illegal performance-enhancing drugs because they are following their idols, the plain simple idea. Because when these kind of athletes, right, when they kind of decline, when these kind of athletes on the non-professional level, they idolize these kind of these kind of athletes on the professional level, right? They would want to follow their footsteps just because they admire them. And it's not legitimate because they're not playing on the professional level. It's not legitimate for them to take drugs. So at the end of the day, they resort to this kind of illegal performance-enhancing drugs because they don't have the funds, right? Okay, now on the second level, right? under their paradigm decline, which they claim will actually provide a balanced playing field, but that's not the case. And under their paradigm, they have two problems. They don't even balance the playing field in the first place, and they actually exacerbate the situation. Now, let me tell you why. Because on their point about competitiveness, now it's fair for everyone, right? On this example, let's say a richer country, they have this kind of capability, they have this kind of funds, right, to actually have this kind of research about this kind of drugs. But when they do get this kind of drugs, and the poor countries that do not have that kind of funds or capabilities to research on this kind of drugs, why would a rich country in the first place want to share this kind of drugs? Why would the rich countries want to distribute this kind of drugs to other poorer countries? Because now they have the kind of upper hand. And at the end of the day, we tell you that it doesn't, there's no form of effort on how they are trying to level the playing field, because the richer countries will always have the upper hand on those kind of poorer countries who don't have the funds to research on these kind of performance enhancing drugs decline. Okay, now moving on to the third level about discrimination, right? Because we can see that the people, there's this group of people who are not able to take this kind of drugs because their country or their club are unable to supply them with this kind of drugs. Right? We can see that these kind of people, they do not want to take this kind of drugs, or they are unable to take this kind of drugs. Right? They'll be left behind in the sport, right? Because we can see that they cannot compete with the richer countries, with the richer clubs that are able to provide their players with these kind of performance enhancing drugs. Okay, decline. Okay, so now at the end of the day, when the richer countries, right, they get this kind of upper hand, right, we can see there's no form of playing field, and it exacerbates the situation. How? Because now you're actually producing a new form of discrimination on the athletes on richer countries, on the athletes on the poorer countries. Yes, Nimble.
Your problem is that now you cannot, or you have some form of effect of society. Is my problem as a fan that I only can contribute to certain professionals because they are the ones that have the capacity and have the money. Then I can't support people that are from a lower country or from third world countries because I only can support the professionals that you not.
Okay, very simple. Nimble has totally pointed out the fact that how he contradicted himself on his point about leveling the playing field, right? Because he talked about now, all these kind of supporters will only support that one country, that capable country, will only support that capable club. What about the poorer countries, right? What about these kind of poorer countries, these kind of poorer athletes? What will happen to them then? Then there's no form of balance playing field, because now only one group, only the upper hand, or the people with the upper hand have that kind of benefits, right? Okay, so now in the long run, we tell you that all the athletes, right, let's run on the best case and the worst case scenario. On the best case scenario, right, we tell you that the people, even if they do enjoy the sport, which is not the case, right, they'll all this kind of even if they do, which it just shows that the government is not even trying to level the playing field, because they're just trying to have this kind of perverse idea to actually make these kind of games more entertaining. And on the worst case scenario, on the example of Lance Armstrong, where people despise performance enhancing drugs, at the end of the day, these kind of people won't even watch the game in the first place, and how the people won't even have this kind of, and how the sports at the end of the day cannot generate that kind of income. So we feel the side opposition takes this debate. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Arjun, for your speech. Now, I welcome the opposition.
Mr. Speaker, a world of drugs. That is what side government is trying to create right now, right? Because they cannot solve the simple problem of there being few people in status quo who already take drugs. They now want to tell you something like, oh, since we cannot regulate these few people, let's just make everybody else take a drug, right? That's what they are trying to do, because they cannot regulate this problem, right? And we tell you how this is particularly harmful to people is that government knows there is a tangible harm of all these kinds of steroids and all these kind of things, how it will cause actually your muscle degeneration, how it will actually cause you to have Parkinson's disease. It is a known fact, and these are very severe kind of diseases that can occur to you. Like Parkinson's is a chronic disease. Now, where it differs from hardcore training, from 23 hours of training, right, where it differs is that these kinds of training, right, you do have days in between where regulated rest days and whatever, right? And also besides that, moreover, right, you can see that these kinds of training, right, is different because that these kinds of harm that is brought upon you is not a permanent harm. If you tear a ligament, if you tear a muscle, right, you can eventually recover from it. These kind of things, and then you still be stronger afterwards later, right? And it's not like you hurt your body later on when you're not in a sporting kind of environment anymore, like you cannot walk or anything because of these kind of facts, right? It hurts you when you take drugs that affects your future life, right? Because we see that a lot of people are short-sighted in these kind of athletes where the whole main point is about competitiveness, right? We see that they take these kinds of drugs, right, simply because of the fact that they want to compete within each other. And how this will work out is what will happen in status quo. What's the possible outcomes, right? Is that actually in itself, people, there will be two groups of people. People who are easily willing to take these kind of drugs and people who refuse to take these kind of drugs. At first, it will be a very uneven kind of sport playing field because now you have half the group of people taking all these kind of drugs, and then you have half the group of people not taking all these kind of drugs, and then there'll be an inequality of sports, and then there wouldn't be a very fun thing to watch. And then for the society, they would frown upon these people who take drugs because these people are people who actively harm themselves because they feel that it's an easy way out, it's for the better route of themselves, right? And then for the people who don't take drugs, eventually these people will be pushed out into sports. Hence, discrimination will occur to these people simply because they do not want to take drugs. Suddenly, they are not worthy of becoming a professional athlete because they do not want to take drugs. And what happened is that eventually, in the sporting world, the professional sports world, it will all be it'll be all compromised of like all of just people who take drugs, right? It will all just be it would all just revolve around people who take drugs, who are willing to make the sacrifice to take drugs. And then we see that at a point that since everybody takes drugs, and it becomes to this peak, right? Because they talk about peak performance and effectiveness, right? There's no longer this kind of like competitiveness as strong anymore. Because now, right, it doesn't matter how hard you train, it doesn't matter how hard I train, it doesn't matter how disciplined I am, it doesn't matter how talented I am, right? As long as I take drugs with you and you take drugs with me, we're gonna be even. We're gonna be on an even playing field, like these kind of levels already. And it's totally wrong. We believe that the whole point of sports, right, is to bring out these kinds of things that people, these kind of values that people look up to, right? Not these kinds of values where people, where you take drugs and all these kind of things, and then people do not like these kind of values, as already proven in status quo when Lance Armstrong actually consumed steroids to win, right? And this gives him an unfair advantage, a very distinct unfair advantage, and therefore it's frowned upon the people, right? And we see that these kind of values suddenly disappear. The values of respect for the game, the values of working hard, the values of discipline, all these values disappear with government suddenly allowing people to take drugs. And why this is the case, right, is because now you do not have to work as hard or whatever, right, in order to become that good, right? And that is exactly the reason why people watch sports, because they know they train, they know how hard these people are dedicated to the game, not just the fact that they are willing to take drugs and compromise their bodies for the glory of the sport. And we believe that it's very perverse of government to actually incentivize these kind of people to take drugs and ruin their bodies of their future, right, in order for them to get the best possible game that they can have, the most exciting kind of game. We believe it's unjustified, and we believe that status quo can also provide the same even playing field that is already in status quo itself, which is why we here on side opposition should take this debate. Thank you.
This debate boils down to whether or not the characteristics or harms that performance-enhancing drugs produces is the same as any other method of enhancing your own body. Side government provided you from the get-go as to many reasons as to why performance-enhancing drugs are similar. You harm yourself with performance-enhancing drugs, you harm yourself when you take dangerous diets. You harm yourself with performance-enhancing drugs, you harm yourself when you take dangerous equipment, when you strain your body and harm yourself. What are the three arguments against side opposition, and how do we deal with them? Number one, they talk about how it's harmful to your body, then and therefore we ban it. Number two, how it punishes the sport. Number three, discrimination. How do we deal with these three arguments? Number one, about the idea of harmful. Number one, you already allow harmful substances when it comes to enhancing your body. Things like diets, things like if you don't get iodine, which some sportsmen do, they have goiter. We think allow individuals to participate in this. For example, Carlos Cuela, the footballer who died as a result of having a harmful diet. These are the kind of things that we already allow the status quo. We think it's simple enough and it's exactly the same as the harm performance enhancing drugs. Second response was they provided to you that you don't really want to subscribe to it. You don't have to subscribe to it. You already know who will do it, who won't do it, because of a database to determine that. Number three, Their argument is against all bad things because they told you that it's addictive, they can harm your body, that is dangerous. Same thing. McDonald's is addictive, smoking can harm your body. Do we still ban them because other individuals don't get it? We understand that it's legitimately harmful, but you as an individual have the right to make your own decision for your own self, just like any other decision. Second argument on how it tarnishes the sport, because it doesn't work. Because just because you take a performance enhancing drugs doesn't mean you immediately become the best sportsman in the world. You still have to train, you still have to do things, you don't just immediately get away just like that. But secondly, the idea of how richer people get richer drugs and better drugs. There is a limit to how good drugs can be. You can't create a better painkiller because that's the best you can already do. Just because you have more money doesn't mean you can produce the same. This means that all these things are opportunities that everyone can afford to, even the poorer countries, thus pushing up to the same pedestal. But the response is that the negative precedents already exist. At least we try to mitigate it. The unbalanced playing field exists because under their side, the richer country will have the better sportsmen, will have the better sports. Under our side, we try to bring up the poor countries by giving them an option which is performance enhancing drugs, which is just as legitimate in other matters. But the other thing is discrimination. This is the third argument that came from that. Number one, we have transparency. If you really don't like discrimination, really don't like sportsmen who isn't taking drugs, status quo. The second response is because status quo it determines like this. Because he told you, no matter how hard I train, the richer me, he has better facilities than me. This is because it doesn't matter how hard, because I told you that the talent will be undermined. In status quo, talent is already undermined, Mr. Speaker, because it's based on how rich you are, how much equipment you already have. You think it's problematic. Because it questions us. If I see my friend taking performance enhancing drugs, wouldn't I want to do the same? Similar to status quo. What if I see my friend taking a dangerous diet? What if I see my friend taking a dangerous equipment and using it? Wouldn't I do the same as well? The same thing happens with the status quo, Mr. Speaker. We don't see any different to do so. But I told you, society doesn't want, because he told you that people have influence upon children and how this influence is dangerous with the status quo. Similar to that, every job has its consequences and every job has influence. I would like to be a beatboxer, or I would like to be go in boxing because I think it's cool to begin with status quo. Does that mean we ban everyone from boxing because it harms and influences children? We don't think it's fair enough to do so. Under our side, we proved to you two things. Number one, how we told you that's exactly the same. We principally argued to you why it's exactly the same as any method of enhancing yourself, then and therefore you should be given the ability to enhance yourself in this particular matter. Number two, we talked about how you allow individuals to make their own decision because there is no third party harm. You recognize your own self, you're an adult, you understand the consequences, you consent to the harms, and therefore you make those decisions. Number three, we talked about black market and transparency. This is an argument in particular that was not responded to by the side of opposition. Why so? Because Lance Armstrong was only discovered that he took performance enhancing drugs after 4 years of taking the drugs to begin with, Mr. Speaker. These are examples of when drugs, when it's illegal, it's extremely hard to detect whether or not the person can do so. Under our side, we have regulations, you have transparency, you have the ability to see and note who is a person taking drugs, who is not. But I told you about how coaches force these individuals and how coaches do so. Sir, when you have transparency, and this is what we told you from the get-go, if you have transparency and you have a way to see who is forcing you and who is not, we can already punish you with status quo. It doesn't happen on their side because everything is under the dark. We are very, very proud to propose.
Thank both teams for great discussion and this one side.